Today we'll provide a brief introduction into how to use SPSS. When you first open up SPSS, you will see it looks somewhat similar to using Microsoft Excel. We have a grid-like format and we can see the number of different cases down the left-hand side. However, there are a few differences as well. Let's start along the very top bar. We have File, which is where we can open new data, new syntax, new output, or we can open pre-existing. Otherwise, we could import from, say, Excel or other data files. We have the option to save or to save as well as a whole lot of other options. If we come across then to the Edit tab, in the Edit tab, we have the option to undo or redo. We could insert new variables or insert new cases. And we also have an Options tab, which will allow us to change our display options. And this will be demonstrated in a future module. If we then come to the right under the View tab, this allows a few different options to change views. The Data tab is where we can actually play around with the physical data. So we can define variable properties. Perhaps you might like to identify duplicate cases. You might need to transpose your data, so moving it from one format to another format. So for instance, from wide to long. We might need to restructure, aggregate, split it into multiple files. We might need to merge files, or we might need to select just specific cases within the data set, or even split the file. Under Transform is where we physically change one of the variables. So we can compute a new variable. So we could compute age from date of birth, for instance, or BMI from height and weight. We could recode a variable into the same variable, which would replace the pre-existing variable, or we could recode something into a different variable. For example, if you have collected the data in a continuous format and then you want to create categories, we could use this to categorize that data. Analyze is where we do the data analysis. So there's a whole range of different options here, such as descriptive statistics, comparing means, linear models, mixed models, correlations, regressions, forecasting, survival analysis, and ROC curves. The next tab is in graphs, and in graphs is where you can generate different graphs such as line graphs, bar graphs, etc. The next bar along is where you have a range of different options that you can actually add and remove. We have our standard opening button, save button, print button. This little drop down here is a recall button. So once we already do a command, so say for instance we ask it to provide descriptive statistics, we left click on this button and it will recall the most recently used descriptive statistic option. We have our undo and our redo, as well as a few different options along here, which depending on how your SPSS is set up, may appear differently on different computers. When we have a look at this main screen here, down the bottom you can see my data view tab is currently highlighted. This means I can see all my data points. Along this top line are my variable names. So in this data, we have our ID number, our sex, date of birth, weight, height, and we have room to write extra comments. Down the left-hand side, it has numbered all our cases. So we can see that in this data set, we have 10 cases available. If we come back down to the bottom again, we can now see variable view. Left click on variable view, and this will provide a little bit more back-end information to each of your variables. On the left-hand side will be the name of your variable, and you'll note that there are no spaces in these variables. So with SPSS, to name a variable, you need to make sure that it is short, starts with a letter, and that it doesn't have any spaces in between. type will provide you with what type of variable. So is it numeric? Is it date-based? Is it string? With string meaning that you can write letters and words and comments. The width is how many spaces it allows. So for instance, if our comment section was only limited to a width of 2, you would only be able to write 2 letters. So we sometimes for our comments open this up to 1,000 or 2,000 to stop this being truncated. This is the same with any other variable that's here. In our decimals column, this is just as per Excel or any other kind of data source that you'll be using. How many decimal places would you like the data to be shown to? Label allows us to expand on our variable name. So you can have spaces in here and you can use other characters as well. Some people like to include information such as how something's coded or when the data was collected, or say if you calculated age, perhaps you want to write what date the age was calculated as. We then have values. So unlike Excel, whereas if you code something as a 0 and a 1, Excel does not know what value is behind that. Whereas in SPSS, we can actually assign that category name. So in this case, we know that for sex, all the 1s are male, and in this case, all the 2s are female. And to edit this or to see further, we can see that there's a little 3 dots that are here. We left click and that will pop up and tell us a little bit more about it. Missing will enable us to assign a missing value so that we know that that hasn't been missed in our data input and that that value is actually intended to be missing. It also allows us to filter out for that missing variable later. We then come across to measure, and if we click down, we can see we've got our 3 options. So nominal is normally some kind of categorical variable or just a variable that doesn't have any order assigned to it. So things such as ID number. Ordinal means that there's some kind of order. So this might be a scale variable or it could actually be a categorical variable, but it means there's some kind of order. So perhaps it might be a Likert scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or it might be BMI category, where we know that someone that is in the underweight category weighs less than someone in the healthy weight who weighs less than someone in the obese category, but we're not actually sure on what that ratio is between the 3. So we can't say someone in the healthy weight category is twice the weight as someone in the underweight category, but we do know there is some kind of order to it. Other examples might be small, medium, large, slow, moderate, fast, etc. And finally, we have our scale variable, which is our ratio variable. So this is always a continuous variable, and it means that there is some kind of ratio between the integers. So for instance, height, weight, where we know that 10 centimeters is always half of 20 centimeters, or that 10 kilos is double 5 kilos.